You probably heard something along the lines of Islam is violent and evil, whilst also hearing the oft-repeated question, why don't Muslims condemn terrorism? Usually from conservatives, so we'll just cue that.
Do you think Islam is at war with the West?
I think Islam hates us. There's something there that there's a tremendous hatred there. There's a tremendous hatred. We have to get to the bottom of it. There is an unbelievable hatred of us.
In Islam itself?
You're going to have to figure that out.
We always hear about the radical Islamists, and I do believe that the rise of radical Islam is a clear and present danger to the world. Then we've got moderate Muslims, too many of which, I want to ask you both, in my view, are silent.
What we need to do, I think, is encourage the imams and the clerics to come out and condemn the radical elements of that faith.
There is a sickness within Islam.
Okay, go to any mosque or Islamic school in the United States. Ask any Muslim organization in the United States. Ask them this: what kind of program do you have to teach young Muslims that the understanding of Islam represented by the Islamic State, which you condemn, is wrong? There is no such program anywhere. Anywhere.
So for all our powers of reasons and us talking about moderate and peaceful Muslims, I'm glad you're here. But where are the others speaking out?
The fact is that I've always said there are a lot of moderate Muslims. They're just pretty silent these days.
So you get nice middle to upper class Muslims from nice families who are westernized and assimilated, and they're your friends. And you think, gosh, these people are saying such terrible things about Muslims, but I know so many nice Muslims, that can't be true. Well, it's because of where you are in the world, right? So you have those nice middle and upper class Muslims, and you have terrorists. That's all you have here.
If Islam is a religion of peace, why is there no popular Muslim peace movement?
Now to the viewers, you want us to fight globalism? The sword of the New World Order is Islam. You want us to stand up for freedom? You want us to promote sovereignty? We're doing it. And I'm very honored to be under attack by all these people. But I'm here to tell you, if you want to support the broadcast, go to InfoWarsStore.com and buy those products.
Sometimes even those who identify themselves with the left take a similar tone, so second incoming montage now.
Would you come to this table and have a debate about this with a moderate Muslim?
Find one, yes. Find one.
I promise you I'll find one.
Find a Muslim.
I do believe that what we see with ISIS is not representative of...
As I said, connecting tissue.
It's not representative of the Islamic religion. Again, I don't think the Quran teaches them to do this kind of
Well,
thing.
You're wrong about that. The Quran absolutely has on every page stuff that's horrible about how the infidel should be treated.
The promise of a martyr's heaven, which is... We cannot deny that this is part of Islamic doctrine. Martyrs go straight to paradise.
Yes, but not terrorists, not murderers, not criminals.
Well, they believe that because they're told it by their imams.
But then what about the majority of the world's Muslim clerics and ulama who came out and condemned 9/11 straight
Well, I'm
afterwards?
delighted they did, but they were pretty quiet about it.
Osama bin Laden is not the Reverend Jim Jones of the Muslim world. It would be wonderful if he were, but the problem is he is giving a truly straightforward version of Islam, and you really have to be an acrobat to figure out how he's distorting the faith. Now, if these guys were Jains, or Buddhists, or Amish, or Quakers, it would be patently obvious how they were distorting their religion. I mean, in fact, their behavior would be unintelligible. Okay? It is not obvious by the light of Islam, and this is just a fact we have to speak honestly about. And no one should be speaking more honestly about this and more volubly about this than moderate Muslims. Moderate Muslims have to find some way to grapple with this fact.
So yeah, there's a lot of negative sentiments out there, clearly. And if you look at recent political developments, whether it be the election of Trump, Brexit, or the rise of populism and identitarianism in the West in general, it's not really possible to deny that Islam and accompanying concerns over national security are often at the center of attention. We're often reminded of the dangers of Islamic doctrine by a kind of rogues gallery of commentators and vloggers, many of whom are eager to paint Muslims as alien to Western societies containing more terrorist sympathizers than is often acknowledged. These efforts are the result of either willful ignorance or blatant propaganda, and have clearly gained some degree of traction. For example, according to a Chatham House study about European public opinion on Muslim immigration, majorities in all but 2 of the countries polled voiced support for a permanent halt. The study notes that recent terror attacks and fears of terrorists posing as refugees likely explain these figures, whilst also noting the prominence of far-right groups, quote, looking to mobilize this angst over Islam into the ballot box. Of course, this study occurred in the context of debates surrounding the real travel ban proposed by Donald Trump. The Chatham House study also links to research previously conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2016, and those results weren't particularly encouraging either. So, not too much love for Muslims, and due in no small part to the notion that they simply don't condemn terrorism enough, and that condemnations are so sparse precisely because violence is inherent to Islamic teachings. So that seems to be that. Islam is the problem, except that this is wrong. In fact, there's something of an untold story when it comes to Muslims opposing terrorism, not just because it's trendy and appeasing to wider society, but rather because Islamic teachings, as expressed by scores of Muslim scholars, opposes it. But these voices are often drowned out by the kind of rhetoric at the beginning of this video, which means a lack of coverage. For example, research from Media Matters found that, following the Orlando shooting, hardly any Muslim guests were featured to discuss the attack. So there we are, we have a predictably low figure of 5% in the case of Fox News, but MSNBC and CNN didn't leave me very impressed either. This problem is compounded by the fact that, in place of educated academic voices, the public is often exposed to quote-unquote terrorism experts and journalistic opinion, much of which presents a crude picture whilst often seeking to monetize the subject. In his book, The Far Enemy, scholar Fawaz Gerges puts it as follows. On the whole, scholars of the Middle East relinquish the field to security consultants and journalists who now possess a monopoly over the quote-unquote science of terrorism, and a cottage industry, to cite Capel, a French scholar of Islam, worth billions of dollars. These consultants and journalists are now considered the experts on terrorism. Academics who feel that the subject is too contemporaneous and contentious to merit scholarly investigation have kept their distance. So, between the terror attacks, anti-Islam rhetoric, and media ineptitude, it's little wonder why Muslim voices opposing terrorism remain largely unknown in the public sphere. Even so, these Muslims still try to make themselves heard, and I may as well do my bit to help them along. So, what follows is a brief, although much needed history of Muslim opposition toward terrorism, beginning with the pre-9/11 era. Here we go. So I'll begin with Egypt during the 70s, when student groups on university campuses were among the first militants to advocate the violent establishment of an Islamic State via what they claimed to be Jihad. Chief among these were al-Jum'ua Islamiyya, or in English, the Islamic Group, or IG, and also Islamic Jihad. These groups acquired a kind of manifesto in the form of al-Farida al-Ghaiba, or the Neglected Obligation, written not by a Muslim scholar, but rather the electrical engineer Abdul Faraj, who assembled the various existing militant groups to form the umbrella organization Tanzim al-Jihad, or Jihad Incorporated. So this group would go on to assassinate then-President Anwar al-Sadat in 1981, and conduct a string of attacks against the Egyptian state. This marked the beginning of a bloody standoff, which lasted into the 1990s, claiming thousands of lives. However, a clear stalemate after years of bloodshed combined with the torture of thousands of captured militants in Egyptian prisons prompted doubts about the viability of violence as a political method. Even more importantly, the Egyptian state, as a matter of self-interest, made sure to supply an array of Islamic scholarly works to imprisoned militants, including standard reference works on Islamic law. Most militants were, in fact, unlearned from an Islamic perspective, which scholars Lisa Blades and Lawrence Rubin found, in their words, to be, quote, quite ironic, given their deep level of commitment to change based on religious conviction. It was in this context of uncertainty and later re-evaluation that founding members of the IG, referred to as the historical leadership, underwent a significant Islamic paradigm shift, denouncing violence as a means to achieve their objectives. Many of their followers came round to this, and in 1997, this pacified faction launched an important project called the Initiative to Stop the Violence. The best reference work I've read on this subject comes from the Islamic Studies professor Sherman Jackson, entitled Initiative to Stop the Violence, Sadat's Assassins and the Renunciation of Political Violence. So we'll take a look at that. This is a quote from Muhammad Al-Amin, a rank-and-file member of the IG, who introduced the initiative as follows. The historical leadership of Ulama Islamiyya calls upon their brethren from among the leadership and the rank-and-file to terminate without stipulation and with no prerequisites all armed campaigns and all communiques that call for such, both inside and outside of Egypt, in the interest of Islam and the Muslims. So the historical leadership was comprised of 8 men, all IG veterans, who had been on the consultative council of the IG in the days of Abdul Salam Faraj, so the early days basically, and thereby possessed a great degree of credibility among the rank and file. Now, I wouldn't claim that they were able to convince everyone with ease, they didn't. Attacks were still being conducted, of course, and certain stalwarts refused to change their ways. However, the initiative did manage to spark a significant debate. It's worth considering Jackson's take on the motivations of the historical leaders when proceeding with the initiative. Jackson notes that scholars give 3 different reasons as to why they decided to change. Number 1, a deal with the state. Number 2, giving in to state pressure. Or number 3, making a re-evaluation based on reference to Islam. Jackson believes all of these were relevant and impacted their decision. He appears to accept the idea that Islam itself was the main factor, given the historical leaders always denying giving in to state pressure, as well as reports from detainees that they proposed the idea to the state first. Most importantly, they made repeated references to Islamic concepts within their work. As Jackson puts it, the Gamal leadership thoroughly familiarized themselves with the classical discourse on Sharia, not to mention an interesting array of modern Western works. Indeed, they limit themselves neither to a particular school of thought, madhab, nor a particular era. Rather, the entire tradition presents itself as a cornucopia of sorts, from which they draw views in support of their new perspective. So thereafter, the historical leadership would go on to release 4 booklets, which sought to refute the violence they once advocated. Whilst only some of the rank and file within the IG agreed with the historical leadership initially, this would change following 9/11. The Soviet Union also invaded Afghanistan, leading to the emergence of the Mujahideen with the support of Pakistani intelligence and eventually with backing from the CIA. Enter Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Initially, bin Laden was on cordial terms with Saudi scholars until the Gulf War in 1990, when the Saudi government allowed American troops on its soil to fight Saddam Hussein. Thereafter, bin Laden broke ties with bin Baz and all scholars associated with any Muslim regime, all of which he condemned as pro-American and tyrannical. Throughout the 90s came a string of al-Qaeda related attacks, including the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the US Embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. all of this serving as a prelude to 9/11 and the War on Terror, bringing us to Part 2. So it's clear that 9/11 caused Muslim terrorism to be more of a concern than ever before. That was the cue for various media pundits to ask the question anew, just where are the moderate Muslims condemning terrorism? Yet, despite all the questioning, Muslim condemnations came thick and fast. So here's a collection of statements on the 9/11 attacks compiled by Charles Kurzman, a specialist in Middle East and Islamic studies from the University of North Carolina. The collection includes various condemnations from Muslim scholars, intellectuals, community organizations, and also the Organization of Islamic Conference, the representative body of Muslim nations. By the way, I've put links in the description for online sources, so do check them out if you want to read more. So here's another page linking to a statement signed by various academics, both Muslim and non-Muslim, this time the work of Omid Safi, Professor of Asian and Middle East Studies at Duke University. American Muslims are good neighbors, devoted to their families and to following God's commands to do good works. There are now some 8 million Muslims in the United States, and mosques are to be found in most every major city. The overwhelming majority are peace-loving human beings who share the shock and despair of all Americans. They know that terrorist acts in the name of Islam are a perversion of their most sacred beliefs, and the actions of a few should not characterize the whole. So now we return to the historical leadership of the Islamic group and the initiative to stop the violence. In 2002, they published 4 manifestos aimed at refuting extremist ideology under the title Silsilat Tashil Mafahim, or Correcting Misunderstandings. These texts were sent to Al-Azhar University, the leading Sunni Islamic center of learning, for review by the Council of Islamic Research, who corrected minor mistakes and gave their approval. The historical leaders based their critique on the Sharia principle of maslahah, or underlying objectives of Islamic law, in addition to fiqh al-waqi', or contextual Islamic jurisprudence. In essence, their view is that if any ruling of Islamic law is implemented but does not serve the underlying objective for which it was established, then the implementation of the rule must be reassessed. This reassessment will be made in light of the current context. In other words, fighting against the Egyptian state was seen to damage the image of Islam, whilst also serving the interests of America, Israel, and other nations, with the enabling of anti-Islam propaganda. As a result, they believe that fighting should be deemed Islamically prohibited. On the 7th of July 2005, a series of coordinated suicide attacks in London killed 56 and injured hundreds. In response, hundreds of Muslim scholars and imams condemned the attacks and issued a fatwa, stating, "Islam strictly, strongly, and severely condemns the use of violence and the destruction of innocent lives. There is neither place nor justification in Islam for extremism, fanaticism, or terrorism. Suicide bombings, which killed and injured innocent people in London, are haram, vehemently prohibited in Islam, and those who committed these barbaric acts in London are criminals, not martyrs." In the same month, a conference was convened in Amman, Jordan, in which 200 of the world's leading Muslim scholars issued a unanimous ruling seeking to curb sectarianism, forbid takfir, or accusations of apostasy, and emphasize that it was only Muslim scholars who had the right to issue fatwas, contrary to the attitudes of many extremists. So here's a quote. "On religious and moral grounds, we denounce the contemporary concept of terrorism that is associated with wrongful practices, whatever their source and form may be. Such acts are represented by aggression against human life in an oppressive form that transgresses the rulings of God, frightening those who are secure, violating peaceful civilians, finishing off the wounded, and killing prisoners. And they employ unethical means, such as destroying buildings and ransacking cities." Then a verse from the Quran, "Do not kill the soul that God has made sacrosanct, save for justice." We condemn these practices and believe that resisting oppression and confirming justice should be a legitimate undertaking through legitimate means. We call on the people to take the necessary steps to achieve the strength and steadfastness for building identity and preserving rights. Later in August, Muslim scholar Afifi al-Akiti published Defending the Transgressed, a detailed fatwa against targeting civilians. The fatwa is forwarded by Lebanese scholar Gibril Haddad, who branded terror advocates as deviant and lauded the fatwa for its, quote, clarity of thought and expression, together with breadth of knowledge of Islamic law. The fatwa is a response to the now infamous al-Muhajirun, a group in the UK which claimed that Muslims were allowed to conduct attacks against Western countries in retaliation for casualties in Afghanistan, Iraq and elsewhere. Al-Akiti rejects this view, using his knowledge of the Shafi'i school, one of the four main legal schools of Islamic jurisprudence. There is no khilaf or difference that all of the Shafi'i fuqaha or legal scholars of today and other Sunni specialists in the sacred law from the Far East to the Middle East reject outright the above opinion and consider it not only an anomaly and very weak, but also completely wrong and a misguided innovation. The amal or action cannot at all be adopted by any mukallaf or layperson. In 2007, the Washington Post covered fatwas against terrorism issued by Ali Jum'ua, former Grand Mufti of Egypt, and the influential Shia scholar Muhammad Husayn Fadlullah, covering suicide bombings in particular and condemning sectarianism among Muslims. You're probably seeing a trend here, but there's still more to come. In February 2008, an anti-terrorism convention was held in India by Darul Deoband, one of the main centers of Islamic learning in South Asia. The conference was attended by roughly 10,000 Muslim scholars from different groups, all collectively stating, Islam is a religion of mercy for all humanity. Islam sternly condemns all kinds of oppression, violence and terrorism. It has regarded oppression, mischief, rioting and murder among severest sins and crimes. Later in November, you had the Hyderabad Declaration, organized by the Jamia Ulema Hind, where 6,000 scholars said the same thing. In 2009, Nidal Hassan killed 13 and injured 32 at the Fort Hood military post in Texas. In response, he was widely condemned by Muslims in North America. An example would be Faraz Rabbani of Seekers Hub, a Canadian group of Muslim scholars. In his statement at the time, Rabbani listed 6 reasons as to why the shootings were un-Islamic. These were betrayal of the Ahad or Covenant, referring to Malik's being an American citizen, impermissible deceit, killing those not actively engaged in combat, doing something without clear sanction, and doing something of manifest greater harm for Muslims. In 2010, Tahir al-Qadri published his now famous Fatwa on Terrorism and Suicide Bombings, an extensive text of almost 500 pages, replete with references to Quranic verses, hadiths of the Prophet, and historical Muslim scholars. In summary, Qadri states that killing and torturing civilians is prohibited, and that Muslims should seek change through non-violent political action. He also organized a press conference in London, where he briefly summarized the book. Qadri also noted that the media tends to focus on terrorists and extremism to the exclusion of Muslim condemnations.
My dear and respected audience and the journalists and the leaders of the community, I would say a wrong image has been presented about Islam in the Western world. The reason is that media is always interested in news. And peaceful people never create news. This is the first time I would congratulate you that a declaration of peace has created a news. Throughout the history, media is always looking for news, and a terrorist creates news which peaceful person cannot do. So that's why they were always being propagated and promoted. And the picture which Western world got about Islam and Islamic Ummah and community, that was because of the terrorist people and the people shouting here on the roads and saying we will hit America and we will hit Britain and we will do this and that, the silly people. So these were the news which have been always promoted, and they are very few people, but they are armed. Single armed person is powerful than 100 unarmed persons.
In the same year, the Global Center for Renewal and Guidance organized a conference in Mardin, Turkey, in which it highlighted the misuse of a historical fatwa issued by the 14th century Muslim scholar Ibn Taymiyyah. This was led by Abdullah Bin Bayyah, arguably the foremost Muslim scholar today. So here's a quote from the statement. "Security measures, no matter how fair and just they may happen to be, cannot take the place of an eloquent, scholarly elucidation supported by proof and evidence. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the Ummah's religious scholars to condemn all forms of violent attempts to change or violent protest within or outside Muslim societies." It's also worth referring to Yahya Michaud, a Belgian scholar and specialist on Ibn Taymiyyah, who disagrees with the emphasis placed on the Mardin fatwa by these scholars, though he does agree that it has been misunderstood and cannot be used as a resource to justify terrorism. Michaud authored Muslims Under Non-Muslim Rule, a book on the treatment of non-Muslims according to the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah, in which he wrote, quote, "Any wolf eager to pounce on Mardin will certainly have been disappointed." Al-Shabaab. It's an al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, and easily the most dangerous terrorist group in the country. In 2013, 165 Somali scholars condemned Al-Shabaab during the country's National Conference on Extremism. So an obvious trend is being identified here. Not too much scholastic agreement with al-Qaeda or terrorism. Writing in his book The Rise and Fall of al-Qaeda in 2011, Middle East expert Fawaz Gerges expressed the optimistic view that al-Qaeda had failed to win the approval of Muslims at large, and noted the role that Muslim scholars had played in facilitating this. So in his words, Bin Laden's transnational jihad and tactics have been delegitimized from within the world of Islam, discredited and undermined by prominent religious scholars and clerics and former cohorts who jumped ship. Far from gaining traction, Muslims did not jump on Bin Laden and Zawahiri's bandwagon because they view it as aimless and pointless, devoid of a clear roadmap. Writing in his book The Far Enemy, Gerges makes it clear that the media and Western policymakers largely dropped the ball when it came to recognizing this. As he put it, Bin Laden and his transnationalist cohorts have lost the war of ideas, the struggle for Muslim minds. That was a critical achievement overlooked by American commentators and policymakers who turned their attention to al-Qaeda and like-minded militants and overlooked the fault lines among jihadis and the vast societal opposition to global jihad. Had they tuned in closely to the internal struggles roiling Muslim lands, they would have had second thoughts about the military expansion of the so-called war on terror and would have realized that al-Qaeda is a tiny fringe organization with no viable entrenched constituency. Had they listened carefully to the multiple critiques of al-Qaeda by Muslim scholars and opinion makers, they would have had answers to their often asked question, where are the Muslim moderates? Had they observed the words and deeds of former jihadis and Islamists, they would have known that the jihadi movement has been torn apart, and that al-Qaeda does not speak for or represent religious nationalists or Muslim public opinion. However, whilst al-Qaeda may have been on the decline, extremists would capitalize on the instability in Iraq and later Syria in order to use up their own territory and claim a caliphate, bringing us to part 3 and the problem of ISIS. With their emergence, you had the intensification of violence in the Middle East and a string of terror attacks in the West. Many said that ISIS surpassed even al-Qaeda as the most prominent terror threat. In response, over 120 Muslim scholars signed the open letter to al-Baghdadi, which was a clear rejection of ISIS ideology. The letter forbade issuing fatwas without scholarship, ignoring context, killing civilians, mistreating minorities including Yazidis, reintroducing slavery, and more. This particular document was reported on somewhat by the media, though the public debate on Islam and violence continued.
The key thing to recognize that I don't think is part of the argument, but I think should be, is that there are voices that are oftentimes raised in opposition to these jihadists and to these extreme acts. But guess what? They don't get covered. They don't get exposed. And they're not given the same level of platform that we see the jihadists
One reason
get.
they don't get exposed is because they're afraid to speak out.
But you also have other braver souls out there who do speak out and who
who are risking their lives to do that.
Like the Muslim clerics and others from Australia to Europe to the United States just recently publicly put their names on paper declaring their opposition to what ISIS and others are doing. So there are those voices, but where was the coverage? Where was that story to sort of create a different picture?
A similar statement was made around the same time by Abdullah Bin Bayyah after a meeting of the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies in March, when over 250 scholars and thinkers met in order to discuss the problem of ongoing violence in the Muslim world. Sheikh bin Bayyah also released a video to accompany this.
طريق سفك الدماء المتبادل ليست طريقا صحيحا. على هؤلاء الشباب أن يعودوا إلى الحقائق، أن ينظروا إلى الحقيقة، وأن يراجعوا أنفسهم مراجعة صادقة، وأن يتقوا الله سبحانه وتعالى ويعمروا المساجد ويعالج الناس في المستشفيات ويسد الخير إلى الفقراء. هذا هو الطريق.
One of Sheikh bin Bayyah's most notable students is the American scholar Hamza Yusuf, who gave a now well-known sermon entitled The Crisis of ISIS, where he echoed similar statements.
I put something out on the web called The Crisis of ISIS, and it went viral in the Middle East. I think a lot of people saw it. It was translated into Arabic, and I think it just bothered them. It was a little swat to the hornet's nest.
And you really took them on. You argued that they have a flimsy ideology.
My argument was that they don't really have legitimacy in terms of Islamic tradition. Every religion creates sects. It's a natural outcome of any revelation. Christianity has plenty of sects. The KKK see themselves, they swear an oath on the Bible. The man who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin doesn't represent Judaism, although he was a rabbinical student, justifying his actions through Torah and Talmudic tradition. So I think religion goes wrong, and it's very important for voices out there to direct people to the normative tradition. In other words, the mainstream tradition, what the religion and those who understand it best have articulated about it. In Islam, you're looking at 1.3 billion people that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, have nothing to do with violence. There was a book called Are Muslims Distinctive by a social scientist from UC Berkeley, not a Muslim, who wrote this book arguing that in fact stable Muslim societies were less violent than stable Western societies. And that's been my experience. I lived over 10 years in the Muslim world, and I found that Muslims by and large are not violent at all.
It's worth mentioning that Yusuf also founded Zaytuna College, an Islamic college in California which aims to produce scholars capable of countering the ISIS narrative. Later in 2015, he gave an interview where he commented on how negligent the media is when it comes to covering learned Muslim scholars. As he said, "I've been to so many conferences condemning this stuff. The media ignores us. There are books written on this." Doesn't seem like he was wrong. In response to Graham Wood's now infamous article on ISIS, journalist Mehdi Hassan interviewed British scholar Abdul Hakim Murad, who mentioned the consensus of Muslim scholars on this point. Islam has its leadership, its universities, its muftis, and its academies, which unanimously repudiate ISIS. In response to the killing of Christians and the beheading of aid worker Peter Kasich in 2014, American scholar Zaid Shakir condemned the killing and prohibited watching the execution video. Contrary to the image of our religion being put forward by warmongering murderers, Both those who hate Islam and those claiming to be its adherents, Islam is dedicated to helping and assisting the weak and helpless, not using them in sadistic pornographic propaganda films, which, by the way, it is absolutely forbidden to view. Shakir also spoke against the enslavement and rape of Yazidis, and refuted the attempt of ISIS to Islamically justify this. In November 2015, ISIS terrorists killed 130 and injured 413 in Paris. Amidst all the furore, Muslim scholars like Faraz Rabbani and Abdullah Bewley were ignored.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made us responsible for protecting the good and standing up to the wrong. كُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ. You are the most virtuous of communities raised unto humanity. Why? تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. You call to all that is good. وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. And you forbid all that is wrong. So when we see around us that there's ugliness being spread in the name of our religion, there are travesties and terror being committed in the name of our Prophet, we have to realize that we have a collective responsibility. So instead of sitting and watching the news for hours, say, okay, how can I be a part of change for the good? Are there religious understandings in our community that are ugly, that are affecting our youth and causing them to embrace erroneous ways? There clearly are. Now, we're not responsible for those understandings, have nothing to do with the way of the Messenger of Mercy, but we are responsible.
Once again, I and many other Muslim spokesmen find ourselves having to respond to yet another horrific outrage perpetrated by people who call themselves Muslims. Firstly, I must state unequivocally, as I have on every previous occasion, that these atrocities are as much crimes under Islamic law as they are in the eyes of any other legal system, and punishable by the severest penalties.
Remember the de-radicalized members of the Islamic group in Egypt? Well, in 2016, members Naji Ibrahim and Hisham al-Najjar published ISIS, the knife that slaughters Islam and Muslims. As the title suggests, they don't really like ISIS either. Their critique isn't really dissimilar to what others have said. They also condemn the killing of civilians and pretty much everything else ISIS does. Sherman Jackson gave a lecture summarizing the text. So here's some clips.
Ibrahim's and Najjar's critique should give pause to those who tend to look upon Sharia, or what has become known in the West as Sharia law, as invariably contributing to the mentality of ISIS and never fundamentally challenging it. Our authors demonstrate, however, that not only can principal critiques of ISIS come from liberals, secularists, or so-called progressives, they can also come from the pens of bearded men with fundamentalist ties and strong attachments to Sharia. Yes, I think that there are ideological interests that are at play in much of the coverage of, look, you take, how many people have heard about the Jamaat Islamiyya and the renunciation of political violence before tonight? Does that make sense to you? Does that make sense to you? I mean, the largest, most violent jihadi movement in the Muslim world renounces political violence, and we hear nothing about it. Aim is aware he farts up in the mountains of Tora Bora or something like that, and it's international news. But that's why people like myself, yourself, we have to go out there, all right, unearth and present. This is the way it is. Are you going to wait for them to present it for you? Good luck.
In a rare display of interest in what learned Muslims had to say, Fox News interviewed Yasir Qadhi, another prominent community figure and Islamic studies professor. During a brief segment, Qadhi took the occasion to condemn ISIS and emphasize Islamic moderation.
Joining us now is religious studies professor at Rhodes College in Memphis, Dr. Yasir Qadhi. Dr. Qadhi, good morning.
Good morning.
Why are you speaking out so forcefully against ISIS?
Well, I think it's the religious duty of every single Muslim when a group is hijacking the faith, when a group is misrepresenting the faith, to clarify to the broader world that that faith has nothing to do with the brutal actions of ISIS. ISIS and its beheadings, its burnings of people, its viciousness does not represent my faith, and I feel obliged, religiously obliged, to speak out. I, along with all other American Muslims, and really Muslims worldwide, I mean, it's our religious duty, and especially with regards to Muslim clerics like myself, I think it's my God-given duty, I think it's my responsibility to speak out against this group. And so, as long as I'm alive, I ask God for the courage to speak out against every injustice and brutality, including that of ISIS.
Another notable figure when it comes to condemning ISIS is the Syrian-born Muhammad al-Yaqubi, a scholar who published Refuting ISIS, a rebuttal of its religious and ideological foundations. Yaqubi wrote the book partly in the hopes that the media would cover it. By and large, they didn't, despite his urging this. Yaqubi stated, "I urged the media to spread this fatwa, communicate its contents, and establish seminars on television and radio to discuss the explanations and clarifications provided herein." He also noted the negative role the media can play in spreading negative perceptions of Islam and Muslims. The need for clarity is intensified by the fact that a number of Western media outlets jump at the opportunity to promote a false equivalency between the ideology of ISIS and the position of mainstream Muslims, a prominent example being Fox News. These media outlets have found substantial material in this group's fatwas, stances and crimes to promote a fear of Islam amongst the Western masses in a time where the tide of moderate Islam in the West is rising, as is the number of those entering the faith. It's worth mentioning that most Muslim condemnations refer to terror groups as bad Muslims, but they don't say they've left Islam completely because of their actions. However, scholars like Yaqubi do. As with previous examples, Yaqubi's book is full of references to the Islamic tradition in order to support his positions. In essence, Yaqubi is of the view that, quote, "the declaration of ISIS caliphate is invalid, ISIS as a group has left Islam, joining ISIS is forbidden, defecting from ISIS is obligatory, fighting ISIS is obligatory until it is defeated." In July 2016, Umar Mateen killed 49 and wounded 53 in Orlando. Yet again, Muslim leaders issued a statement condemning the attack, making reference to Muhammad Ali, who had passed away just days before, as a model of Islamic practice, whilst quoting the Quran. Quote, "We, as American Muslims, follow the open-hearted and inclusive Islam of Muhammad Ali and completely reject the hatred, provincialism and intolerance of those who trample upon the rights of others, besmirching and defiling the name of Islam. The criminal, who took the lives of dozens of patrons of the Orlando nightclub and injured many others, was an aggressor, plain and simple. The Quran says, 'Do not be brutal or commit aggression, for surely God does not love brutal aggressors.'" To their credit, CNN actually gave some time to Hamza Yusuf in the wake of the attack, wherein they acknowledged that Muslims had issued many statements condemning terrorism, and questioned the need to issue another. In response, Hamza Yusuf lamented the endless repeated condemnations, despite many still wondering why Muslims didn't speak out. As he put it, "We're trapped in this constant cycle of events, condemnation, events, condemnation. And then people still say, why don't Muslims condemn these things?" So, what was the response of ISIS? Well, in a 2016 edition of their Dabiq magazine, they threatened many of these scholars with death, in an article entitled "The Imams of Disbelief in the West." These people risked their lives, to an extent, yet the media still largely ignores them. Those who follow the Muslim community very closely have been frustrated by the lack of clarity on the subject. An example of this is Jonathan Brown, an American Islamic Studies professor who best expressed the futility of even having a debate like this.
And it's not Islamic, is what you're saying. Yeah, actually, this is what's really interesting, is this really kind of, I'd hate to say, this moronic debate that the American public square has been engaged in for over a year now. Is ISIS Islamic? Okay, no Muslim scholars approve what ISIS is doing. None. They condemn their ideology, they condemn their actions. So the idea that somehow all the Muslim scholars in the world, who can't agree on anything, basically, they all agree that ISIS is completely un-Islamic. The fact that we're sitting there saying, oh, is ISIS Islamic or not? I mean, this is really to ignore the global Muslim community. And to say that sort of we as, I don't know, American political analysts or something are actually going to, we're going to agree with ISIS. When ISIS says we're the true Muslims, we're going to agree with them? That's kind of ridiculous if you think about it.
And so here we come to the present day. Of course, I've only offered a sample of the various books, fatwas and organizations against extremism. There are two final sources worth mentioning on this, just to illustrate what I'm talking about. So the first is this page on the American Muslim, run by Sheila Musaji. It's a massive resource featuring various scholars and organizations and their condemnations, only some of which I've covered here. An American Muslim student, Hera Hashemi, created a 712-page Excel document listing thousands of instances of condemnations. If you have a scroll down and look at the sources, you'll hardly ever come across a mainstream media story. It just goes on and on and on. Now, you might be thinking, what about taqiyya? So, for those of you who don't know, taqiyya, according to critics at least, is a doctrine that states that Muslims can deceive non-Muslims until they gain the upper hand over them. Now, one day I'll do a separate video on this altogether, but for now, it's worth referring to scholars Omar Suleiman and Nazir Khan of the Yaqeen Institute. According to them, taqiyya is only valid when one is in mortal danger, and scholars are unanimous that treachery and the breaking of covenants is prohibited. You might also be thinking, well, that's great, except that despite all this, attacks are still happening, so maybe we need to see something more. Maybe Muslims still aren't doing enough. Now, to that I would say, we also need to look at factors external to the Muslim community and see what's going on there, in particular the media and also the political arena. It's already been mentioned that many well-meaning Muslims condemn terrorism, but they're often not reported on, so the media clearly needs to handle that better. Sometimes they'll even acknowledge the efforts that Muslims make, but then say something to rain on the parade. Back when Gavin McGuinness was at Rebel Media, the budget Fox News, which passes for journalism nowadays, he interviewed Katie McFarland, a former advisor to both Reagan and also Trump. Now, McFarland has had a long career and is presented as a foreign policy expert, so you'd expect she might have something reasonable to say like, well, Muslims have been condemning terrorism for a long time, we have to recognize that and look at other factors as well. But, well, just see for yourself.
So President Sisi of Egypt, I met with him about 2 months ago, and he had just gone to Al-Azhar University, which is like their Vatican, and he had said to the leaders of the Muslim religion, you guys, we have a big problem, and that's radical Islam. We didn't snuff it when we should have, and it's up to you, and it's your responsibility to speak out. About a month later, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, who I also met with a few weeks ago, he went to Mecca and he said to all the senior educators of Islam, of Sunni Islam, he said, we have to change, we have to reform ourselves. So what we have been waiting for 15 years was within the Muslim community, we've always been saying, where are the modern Muslims? Why don't they speak up? Why don't they condemn the violence? They in fact have started to do that.
So they've just now started to do that, except that they've been doing it for years, way before 2015, that's for sure, as we've already seen. We're also told that terrorism is the sole responsibility of Muslims to fix, and this comes from a person who served in the Reagan administration, which was responsible for Operation Cyclone, where the CIA funded the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the 80s. I mean, That's ridiculous. Were it not for Operation Cyclone, you likely wouldn't have had groups like the Taliban or al-Qaeda being as formidable as they are now. But I guess that doesn't matter. So far as politics goes, we also need to look at the link between interventionist foreign policy and the growth of terrorism as well. That's something for Western governments to think about quite clearly. This is reinforced by those with a history both in academia and the CIA, an example being Graham Fuller, for instance. Suffice it to say, I plan to tackle these subjects separately in the future, so do look out for that. For now, it seems clear to me that there's a problem with the way in which Muslims are treated and presented in the public sphere. Despite their best efforts, they're still largely ignored by the mainstream media. I'd like to hope this would change, because if it doesn't, you'll only see more of the same. Fear of minorities and those who capitalize on it. Thanks for watching. I'm interested to hear different opinions, so please let me know what you think in the comments. If you like this video, then please check out my Patreon page, where, for $1, you can help to make future videos possible. Ideally, I'd like to work on this channel full time, so any support would be appreciated. Please click the bell to get notified about new videos, and also to like and subscribe. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.